Hello, and welcome back to Young Heretics. This is a particularly exciting show because you guys have been asking a lot when we're going to do music, right? It's been a very literary podcast so far. I tend to love poetry and literature. A lot of my guests have been historians and things of that nature. But this is, in fact, a show about the riches of the West. More generally, it's about everything that the West has to offer, and a centrally important part of that is the musical tradition of the West, going right back to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Jewish tradition of music, which we may get into talking about a little bit on this episode. But the truth of the matter is that I just don't know enough to be going into, modern Western music in great detail, which is why we have another honorary heretic here, a guest, Stephen Limbaugh, who is an extremely accomplished classical composer. You've done scores for all sorts of films, especially political documentaries. Probably people have heard your music without even knowing, because they'll have watched some conservative political documentary or something like that. Stephen, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
I'm just excited to talk about music during this pandemic and see other people for the first time in a while. So it's really, really nice to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also the first live interview that we've done on this.
I'm the first one.
Show. You were the first. Well, I didn't live in the sense of you're physically
here.
Here
yeah.
you are, right? Exactly. Which is it's so nice to see people outside of my immediate circle. And hopefully Gavin Newsom is not a fan of the show, so that he can't come in and shut us down when he sees that you're here. So we've decided, we sort of chatted about what would be a great way to get the show into talking about the Western musical tradition, and you selected out for us this particular period, the Belle Époque period, which is a French name for the sort of the beautiful era, the beautiful epoch. Can you tell us, just for people that don't know, what that is? When does that happen? Where does it happen?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think most people, especially your American listeners, would probably be more familiar with the term the Gilded Age.
Yeah, sure.
Mark Twain talks about it, and people have this idea that this was the time of cigar-chomping robber barons. Carnegie, Upton Sinclair is writing about, these, kids that are getting maimed in meat packing plants or whatever. And
we'll do all of this on the show at some point, by the way. It's the meat packing of Upton Sinclair. It's for a later episode.
Yeah. And so this is kind of the idea that people have. It's either that, or it's everybody dresses like Mary Poppins and they hang out in grassy parks, eating raspberry cream shortbreads and riding velocipedes around the vestibule. This is kind of and it was if you were part of that elite, that was great. There was no middle class, and then everyone was just broke and destitute crammed into, 12 family members crammed into one bedroom apartment in New York City or whatever.
So the classic narrative about this era then is upper class, lower class.
Yes.
You're either the richest of the rich or the poorest of the poor.
Yes.
But this is not the case. Or it is.
I would say that is such a small part of what was going on in that era, because the other things that were happening during that time were still our greatest working theory of physics. In physics is Einstein. Right. We had the Wright brothers, automobiles, Alexander Graham Bell, basically. Mm-hmm. We had Edison. Massive amounts of wealth accumulation didn't sit stuffed under a mattress. It was used,
right?
And it was used for technological advancements, and it was used for the patronage of the arts in a huge way, just like it was in the Renaissance.
So dates-wise, we're talking here typically 1870 up to the First World War.
Yeah, maybe 60, because the United States was in a war then, right. And basically 1860-ish is where I'm kind of marking it. I'm not like a historian in that sense,
sure, right.
But if you call it 1860 all the way up until Archduke Ferdinand's assassinated, that's the Belle Époque.
Because we've been doing a lot actually on this show about some of the literature that was produced during and between the world wars, so just after this era.
Right.
And it's in retrospect, right, that they start calling it the Gilded Age or the Belle Époque, which is that they kind of say, oh, this was before.
Except for Mark Twain. Mark Twain
calls it the Gilded Age.
Wrote the book during that time.
Yeah.
But they still refer to it because all of the all of the traditions, especially in literature, that didn't borrow directly from Shakespeare, borrowed from authors during this time. or even in the dramatic arts. Acting as a craft was fully and firmly established during the Belle Époque, and it was applied, between the world wars, whether it was the 20s or the 30s or whatever. So you can basically trace everything that we've got that's still good in our culture to this era as being the time whenever there was the honing in of the craft, and it didn't matter if it was literature or music or whatever, and also just the pieces that are most frequently performed.
Yeah, so let's get into music in a second, right? Because to me, it's sort of heart-wrenching that you have this period of immense flourishing of craftsmanship, of detail, of art, subsidy of the art, public subsidy, or is it public or private subsidy?
It's both.
Okay, yeah.
So it's significant.
Right, and then the disaster of the modern age basically sweeps in. These two world wars, the suicide of Europe, or whatever you want to call it, just completely tears itself apart. And
communism.
And communism. Yes, let's revisit communism. Sure. But first, tell me why, when I said let's do an episode about music, you said let's do the Belle Époque. What's happening in music during this period that is so significant?
So I think it needs, it's best stated in its context of what had just come and happened in music. So you had Bach in 1700, basically Mozart in 1750, Beethoven 1800.
Okay, so these are the great
greats. Yeah. The German tradition basically establishes the foundations, basically establishes the foundation of tonal music during this time.
Mm-hmm. When you say, just for folks, because this is our first music episode, very bare bones, when you say tonal music, what do you mean?
I mean the tonal music, which means a 12 notes on the piano per octave or whatever. Yep. So it has consonants and dissonants, things that sound dissonant or weird, or things that sound consonant, major and minor modes, if you've heard those terms before.
Sure.
All of this is established with basically a set of rules, music theory, during Bach's time. Mm-hmm. And it's first played out and shown to be incredibly expressive in its aesthetic utility or whatever. And then we get to the Belle Époque,
right? Which
now since they have the rules, this is where you see a lot more breaking of those rules, bending and stretching of those rules. You have more instruments. Mm-hmm. So an example, like music technology advanced a huge amount because of the Industrial Revolution. So people had more access to, valved trumpets, for example. So you can play more than just 3 notes on a trumpet or whatever. Trumpet is usually playing taps or revelry or something like that.
Yeah.
That's all you could do on the old horns or whatever.
Oh, wow, okay.
You make valves and it changes the length of the tube. This is a music technology thing that doesn't happen in a vacuum. You've got to have capital available. You have to have an established tradition and then people wanting to push the boundaries of it to create a market for these new...
So this is really fascinating, and again, let me just, it's such an interesting story, because one of the things about music that I love, or the history of music that I love, is that it sort of requires you to think in terms of every other discipline, essentially, which is what you're saying, right? That, all of this stuff, the economics of it, the history of it, and so forth. So basically, the scale, right, the 12-note scale that you're talking about, in some sense is ancient. This is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? But during the classical period that you're talking about, with Bach and all these greats, they basically standardize in absolute pitch where those are going to be, right?
That's right.
So now you can change key, for example. Right. You can build an instrument that has all these different keys on it, and that's the piano keyboard that you're talking about.
Yes,
right? Okay,
that's right.
So then it's after that you're saying that there's this kind of incredible influx of technology to create these instruments.
To continue to create. Yeah. And I would say the other most important thing was a legal device, and that was the establishment between countries of copyright laws. Ooh. So this made the publishing of musical works a game changer for creators, because now they would have copyright protection. Not if you published in Germany, it would also apply to France, or would apply to Russia or Austria-Hungary or wherever. I think I did read at one point there was some type of people would publish under Mozart's name in England and stuff like that, and they catch them, of course, but it's just once it got standardized, then you get the old school version of VC to come in and start publishing companies. They would go out and they would seek talent and they would want to develop and foster talent. It didn't just have to be Haydn's situation, which was just like, hey, the Esterházy, family is just going to give me money to make symphonies.
Yeah. Well, this is patronage, basically.
Which is just straight up patronage.
Yeah.
Which also, unlike the Renaissance, it's like, the Renaissance didn't have, publishing protection. I mean, it was basically the church was paying for everything.
Yeah.
Of the great works of the masters then.
Yeah. So are you saying basically that in this period, the Belle Époque period, like the market becomes a thing for music in the way that we now, when we think about the market, we think about trade and like a kind of established system of predictable rules for I give you this, you give me money, or so forth. And this, I would imagine, just blows the doors open on the international music community.
Absolutely.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So it's happening, when I say where is the Belle Époque happening in music, the answer is basically like all over Europe. Essentially. In America too?
And it was happening in America as well. Like you get like Scott Joplin, for example.
Yeah.
There is no way the music of Scott Joplin would have become as popular if you didn't have the publishing business. Because you were able to make his sheet music and put it on the stands in places.
Wow.
Or, those piano rolls.
Yeah.
The player pianos like in the saloons or whatever. If you didn't have the technology and that, his music wouldn't have been able to get as popular. You had to be able to print it. You had to be able to sit around and somebody had to make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah.
Who knows if it was back in the day. I'm sure the artists had not probably very favorable terms of their contracts.
Yeah.
Again, this is the cigar chomping robber baron era.
This make, one of the things that we talk about in ancient music, I neglected to mention at the beginning that although I have not studied modern West music in great detail. My PhD was in ancient Greek music.
Which is the coolest thing in the world.
We should get into it because it is really cool. And a lot of this stuff, there are parallels, especially in the philosophy. We'll talk eventually about the philosophy of music.
Sure.
But one of the things that you talk about in ancient music is times when sort of individual named composers become more of a thing.
Right.
The names that you mentioned from this earlier classical period, Bach and so forth, Haydn, right? These guys are famous names now.
Right.
Is it also the case now that when guys start selling their music, do they become kind of more household names?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huh.
Because I think this was the case in literature too, but in the Middle Ages, for some reason, people didn't put their names on stuff. It was all the poems, and they're all anonymous, right?
Right.
Maybe not Chaucer, but a bunch of the other guys, they didn't put their names on stuff. That was happening in music pretty frequently until you get around to what's a good example? Like Vivaldi, who's just before Bach, but a contemporary, but a little bit before him. And then everybody, everybody kind of wants credit for the brilliant music that they're doing.
Well, we're going to...
Understandable.
Well, we will give some of these guys credit in just a second, because I want to get into sort of picking your brain about what some of the major works and composers are that people either will have heard of and be excited about, or maybe haven't heard as much about because they've fallen out of favor. To me, it's fascinating to think about, we consider these things kind of eternal facts of the world, that composers write music, they get royalty for it, it's on a piece of paper or sheet music or whatever, that the piano keyboard exists. But all of these things have a history, right? They come into being. And one of the things you're saying that's interesting is that capitalism as a system enables more of them. And maybe we'll talk more in a second about other systems that don't enable musical creativity. So we are going to give some of these guys credit actually in a moment, because we're going to talk about some of the big composers of the Belle Époque. I'm going to pick your brain about what are the 5 things maybe that people should go away and listen to if they haven't already. But before we do that, I just want to pause for a moment and say to the audience, thank you so much for watching and listening to this show. It is such a joy to be bringing you this content. It's awesome to have Stephen here. If you have not already, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can do it on iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher, or I don't know, there's a million platforms out there. But also, what's really helpful is if you leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. I love hearing from you guys that way, and I love reading them, but it's also very, very supportive for the show. So please leave us a 5-star review, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. So we've kind of, I feel, given ourselves a bit of an orientation in time and history, right? So we are just before the the outbreak of the First World War, the existence of sort of international copyright law has blown the doors open on, the ability of artists to kind of move back and forth and publish their work all over. On top of which, you have these tremendous, capitalism is basically enabling these tremendous technological innovations. You have new instruments, orchestral music that can now be produced, sort of mass-produced, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So tell us now, if you would, I hesitate to say like the one person that people should go away and listen to, because you've just said that this is all over Europe and it's all over America. But let's walk through a few, let's say, of kind of the major composers from this time and what they're doing and what's interesting about them.
Absolutely. So I think if you're going to pick one, this is so difficult, by the way,
good.
to able to pick one.
But plunk for one and die on the hill.
I'll do that.
Okay.
I would say Tchaikovsky.
Okay.
Here's the reason.
Go.
He's expanded the orchestra to much larger than it was in Beethoven or Mozart's day, definitely more so than Bach's day. He is writing music in Imperial Russia at the time. So Tsarist Russia is trying to play catch-up culturally to the rest of Europe.
Why? What's wrong?
Competitive nationalism.
Okay.
This is also height of nationalism, right?
Yeah, so they're all basically fighting back.
The world's open now. British Empire, sun's not setting on it. Like, you get this huge cultural exchange. The world's fairs are happening for the first time. Like, you get a lot of Asian influence as well. Russia's uniquely positioned because it's the only European country that contiguously touches the Pacific Ocean, right?
Right.
So they have this very, very unique position to where they're east meets west, right?
Sure.
But they love, let's say, like Parisian ballet, for example, and they love the Germanic music tradition. So they say, how do we make that Russian? And that's exactly what Tchaikovsky does.
Wow.
And so I think he's one of the best because in his Nutcracker ballet, which everybody's heard, the Nutcracker.
The Christmas ballet.
The Christmas ballet. You have these dances in the second half of it, which there's like an Arabian dance, and then there's a dance from Russia, and then there's a French ballet, and all the cultures from around the world are basically appropriated to this ballet to show that like these are sort of the things around the world, the curiosities that concert goers in anywhere in the country, in the Western world, would have just loved to see and be able to experience and whatever.
So let's just pause and listen for a second to the Nutcracker ballet, which people may have, but almost certainly will have heard, as you say. So what you're saying to me, basically, is that this is the best form of cultural appropriation, right? This is the height of cultural appropriation. And what I love about that is, of course, that this is the show where we kind of like to shrug off identity politics, and one of the sort of central movements of identity politics is to get mad about people taking from other cultures,
right.
and somehow that is dismissive of other cultures or what have you. But effectively, you're saying, no, Russia at this time, much like America in its best artistic movements, is saying we love all of this stuff and we want it. We want like Russian versions of it. So Parisian ballet, I think, is one of the things that you mentioned. What are some of the other kind of musical traditions that that Tchaikovsky, rather, I guess, is drawing into his?
Yeah. So Tchaikovsky would do so. We were talking about that tonal music thing that was established in Germany 100 years earlier, 100 years prior, right? Well, Tchaikovsky wanted to make things, wanted to introduce some Eastern elements. So one of the things that he did was he said there's a rule about not doing parallel fifths. You don't have to know what that is. But all it means is that the Germans say this is a rule, you can't do parallel fifths. Tchaikovsky says, I am going to do parallel fifths in some cases.
Yeah.
And his contemporaries in Russia would do the same thing.
Right.
And they would do it because that's a feature of Eastern music.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they say, since we're this East-West entity,
We're in the middle of these two great...
this would be something that would set our music, Russian music, apart, and how we're competing with other countries.
Yeah.
It's really brilliant, and there was a conscious effort. Like they thought, how can we make Russian music better?
Yeah.
Same thing was happening in Italy with Verdi. Verdi said, I love all of the German operatic composers. I love all these guys. But I want to do things that just glorify the values of Italy.
So this is Verdi. Verdi is composing orchestral. I mean, what's he composing?
Operas,
right.
Orchestral music too, but he's doing operas specifically. He goes, I want to make Italian opera that is about Italian subjects and Italian virtues.
What should people listen to by Verdi on Spotify right this second or after they finish this show?
I would say probably Aida.
Okay.
One of his most famous.
But let's actually do another. Let's do another clip here for a second. Just hear a major theme from Aida. Briefly.
It's very Italian.
It's very, yeah. Well, why do you say that? Well, so you mentioned that this is, so whereas Russia is saying we're going to take all this other stuff and Russianize it, is Verdi also saying the same thing? Is he saying I'll take this stuff and Italianize it, or is he saying I'm going to make something purely new, purely Italian?
So the subject matter is, it takes place in the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt.
Okay,
and so they are taking something, like a historical period in time and making it Italian.
Right.
But I say why it sounds Italian is because if you go, whether it's, a Fazoli's commercial or whatever, they usually have some of Verdi's music that's playing in it, and we just automatically identify, still 100 years later, 150 years later, we still identify that as being authentically Italian, like spaghetti.
Yeah.
It's the spaghetti of music.
That's great. Well, so this is something that the ancient Greeks did as well, and famously, as I'm sure you are well aware, right? They have these different names for the modes, which are forms of, basically like forms of keys, and they are named in many cases after ethnic subsets of Greek society. So there's the Phrygian mode, and and these are, or some of them are not Greek at all, but actually Eastern in exactly the way that you're describing. And so basically, the idea that a nation, which, as you say, we're at the height at this point of being proud of where you come from, how you rule your little fiefdom, and so forth. We're at the height of national pride. And it is one of the central ways that you kind of instill that national pride and celebrate your essential national character is with a kind of national music.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And nationalism, like anything, it can be used for bad purposes, and that's what the 20th century was about, right? But and nationalism and patriotic music can also be pathetically bad, and this country's proof of that. Some of our music here is just awful. With I love Lee Greenwood and that sort of thing, but there are so many artists that try to copy Lee Greenwood's music, and it's just awful.
So this, to me, is fascinating because you've got, obviously, as we have discussed in previous episodes of this show, you're about to have, right after the Belle Époque, you are about to have the great cataclysm of nationalism, the great excess of nationalism, which is kind of all these authoritarian, totalitarian states. And in my opinion, the left in this country has used our trauma from that to make us ashamed of being proud of our nations, right? You know, the idea that there can be an excess of nationalism has been used to make us feel like all patriotism, all American nationalism, or nationalism of any kind is bad, right? It becomes this bad word. But of course, that's ridiculous. If you're going to have a country, you need to have pride in its national character, and there's nothing wrong with having pride in your native land. You know, this is my native land, as the poet says. And I think, you know, this period is kind of instructive for us because, as you are saying, you've got some of the great nationalist artists in this time, right?
That's right. Yeah. And by quantity, too. I mean, it was more so, you know, I mentioned beforehand, you know, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart. I mean, that's 3 over a period of almost 120 years or whatever. Mm-hmm. You get to this part of history, musical history, and you're talking about dozens and dozens. Mm-hmm. So it's exponentially larger just in terms of the quantity of output. It's important to note that as part of the artistic creative process, and I know this as a composer myself, is that you have to have things to write for. So a lot of people will do religious works. They will do, you know, human condition, write about love or relationships or whatever it is.
Right.
But also, you can write about pride in your people or your country and that sort of thing. You know, Brahms, for example, had like his Requiem was for Germany, like Germany itself, you know, because they had pride in where they came from, who they were, and their traditions and that sort of thing. And those are not pieces that are meant to besmirch other folks. You know, not that composers aren't competitive with each other, which is definitely, or countries were definitely competitive with each other. Right. But it was to extol the virtues and just say like, hey, we're proud of what we're making, who we are, our industriousness or whatever qualities it was that they were trying to brag about. But this, you know, whenever you have an objective like that, like I'm going to write a religious work that's going to glorify God, let's say. You're going to have different music that makes it from your brain to the paper that then gets performed by people. It's going to be different than if you're writing about your TV.
Right. Now, there is actually some interesting crossover here with the ancient Greek way of thinking about music. This is one of the things that we still retain from ancient Greece, actually, without even knowing it, is what's been called the ethos theory of music. And ethos is a Greek word meaning character. And so there was this whole tradition dating back to the 5th century in BC and probably before of thinking about different kinds of music, different kinds of song, different modes of music as somehow associated with certain modes of personal character. So this is like brave music. This is, of course, you would know, you'd have much more sophisticated ideas than I about how that works in modern music. But this idea, is it not, is still kind of with us, that what you write for informs somehow, I mean, even beyond the words of a song, if it has words, it informs the kind of aesthetics of music. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely, because, I mean, people talk about, let's say you have major and minor, you know, major's kind of more happy or whatever, and minor's like more sad or whatever. Yeah. But it's, or you can have consonance and dissonance. Right. It's the placement of where those consonants and dissonance take place.
And these, just to define the technical terms, right? So I mean, technical, but major and minor are forms of key, right? So
chords.
Chords and key. And then you mentioned consonance and dissonance before. These are notes that sound good together and notes that sound bad together.
Bad together. But the placement of dissonance is what makes things also artistic. Because if you just had something that was consonant the whole way through, it's not particularly interesting or enlightening in any sort of way. If you have carefully crafted and well thought out dissonance placed in the correct places in a piece that unfolds over time, right? Yeah. You know, and those can be mathematically measured out, as the classicists did, and also in the Romantic era, they just take more liberties about where those things take place. So you get a lot more. It's way, way, way more expressive, and in fact, in music, this is actually called the Romantic period because it's Romanticism, like German Romanticism or whatever. So this is what we're getting at that time, and I think to ignore the nationalism part is something that happens way too often. They just say, oh, they're just being more experimenting, and it didn't matter that one happened to be English or one happened to be French. It's just not the case.
It's sort of, hard for philosophers and easy for artists to say just what exactly it is that music does to us, right? Because we can say at least in some basic rudimentary way that when I say words to you, I'm communicating some idea or some command or some thought. Music has for a long time sort of seemed to people, actually the late great Roger Scruton wrote a little bit about this, but there's a long tradition back before, again, dating back to like Plato and the ancient Greeks, of saying that music is this kind of pure emotion. It's like emotion made audible or something along those lines. And the kinds of technical questions that you're talking about, which note goes where, it's much more complicated, obviously, than like major minor, but it is this kind of way of enshrining these little tiny, ways that you feel, that somebody looks at you askance, and how do you feel now? Or you're going to war for your country, and how do you feel then? There's kind of this. Is that, does this hold water with you, that this kind of like pure emotion in music, or is there more to it than that?
It's a tough question to ask, because like the artsy thing to say is like, yeah, it just pours out of me, man. And it's like, come on, like you have to have a sense of craft. It's the marriage of your left and right brain.
Right.
Because I know musicians who just like, these like guitarists that are like, they smoke a bunch of weed and they're like, dude, I sound better when I'm high. It's like, you don't. You sound categorically worse.
Right.
And it's because you have to have elements of craft and some forethought to be able to communicate all of the emotional stuff. You have to have a vessel, because it's, I would say, like, it's probably a whole lot of pattern recognition, repetition, and playing on those sort of axiomatic functions of human understanding, right? We like patterns, we like repetition, we can put our heads around, we can wrap our minds around those things, whether we see it in art or whether we hear it in music.
Yeah.
And a lot of music, since it's an art that unfolds over time, we can mark, where things should repeat. We can mark where things, where it would be interesting if it didn't repeat there, because that can create some unexpected thing to happen, and then we can resolve it later. There are all these sorts of things that you got to play with, but you have to do it consciously. I know a lot of people, they do have an instinct for it. But they have an instinct for it because they listen to a bunch of music and they're emulating.
So talk to me a little bit about this, because these very, again, it's kind of hard to talk about, but easy to feel the way that these things tend to work in music. These very primal, basic things, like symmetry, for example, or this section's going to repeat here, but it's going to be different this time because you've heard it before, or something like that. And these are very fundamental, just ways that we experience the world. Again, the Greeks, some of the Greeks at least, would have attributed this to math and to physics, and we still talk about the math behind music, that certain, that the wavelengths of certain notes that sound good together are in good proportion and so forth. And so at first it sounds kooky to say, as I think Stravinsky did, that music attended the creation of the universe or what have you. But then when you actually get down to it, it's like basically exactly what scientists do say, right? That the same laws that govern the moving of the planets are the laws that govern the sort of the brain waves that respond to music.
That's right.
All of this, according to some people today, is crap, right? We were just talking about this before we started filming, but let's get it also in this episode, that there is a movement now to say that these ideas, especially ideas about like symmetry and mathematical precision, these are culturally conditioned. People on Twitter right now are arguing that 2 + 2 = 5 for exactly these reasons. And in fact, it's actually kind of racist or chauvinist to want to say that kind of music, the kind of thing that you're saying, that no, you don't sound better when you're high. You sound better when you have like thought carefully after long hours of study about where to place the B flat in like the minor second, whatever. So talk to me about sort of where that's coming from. Why is it that this is something people are currently rejecting in music?
I think it goes back to rejecting all hierarchies. And in traditional Western music, not all notes are the same. If you're in a certain key, there are consonant ones that fit in that key, and there are dissonant ones. Now, this doesn't mean we banish dissonant notes, because we want dissonance, because that's going to the placement of that is going to give us the sort of that catharsis that could take place whenever we're experiencing a piece of art. I'm totally for dissonance. I write dissonant music, but it resolves in a certain way that makes it interesting, that makes it beautiful or whatever. And so since they're now, the postmoderns basically, are rejecting all hierarchies. So if all notes are made equal, all instruments are made equal, and all music is, could be just left to chance, perhaps, you're going to get music that sounds like a cacophony. It's just going to be a mess, and it won't do anything. And they've done lots of experiments with like fully aleatoric music, which is just roll the dice. Okay, it's a 7 and a 2, so we're going to put a C sharp there.
Yeah, aleatoric is music random, right?
Yeah, it's random. Now, you can use, the good part about what they did is since they did have so much experimenting, is that they gave some tools to composers like me who maybe want to incorporate these things at strategic moments. So it's not totally a loss of the 20th century. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to go back and they're trying to say that because Tchaikovsky has, a song where it's the Chinese dance or whatever, that it's racist and you have to take it out of the ballet.
So we should not cancel the national anthem is the answer, basically. Right? We should keep the national anthem. Yeah, okay. So this is, right. I mean, this is so rich because people, this is music getting political in the best sort of way, right? Typically when people say, oh, everything is political, what they mean is like, the government should get to tell you what to do about everything. But in fact, there's a much more subtle kind of relationship that we've been talking about for this entire conversation between sort of ideas that people are having, feelings that people are having, let's say, about their attachment to their country, and ways that they are enshrining those feelings in musical form. And in periods of kind of optimism about the nation and like the Belle Époque, you have incredible sort of outpouring, you might say, profusion of just creativity and excitement. And then in periods like ours, where we have this great sort of anxiety about owning our traditions, you get this desire to kind of do away with all that and just throw, as you say, just roll the dice.
So I'll ask you a question. Okay. Can you tell the difference between German EDM, Korean EDM, and American EDM?
I'm not even totally sure that I know what EDM stands for, to be honest with you.
Electronic dance music.
Thank you. Okay, good. So no is the answer. Why can't I tell the difference?
It's all, basically globalism has tried, since World War II, has tried to make all cultures like this one world type thing. And I'm not talking in the conspiracy theory sense. I'm saying it's like a singular culture, and this is our music that extols the virtue of all humanity being the same. You can do that in music, but they've thrown out everything else. Like, there's literally no difference. Now, one German EDM thing might have like a vocal hook that's in German, like some Du hast mich or something like that, or whatever that song was.
You hate me? Is that what that means? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, it does? Okay.
I think so, yeah. Okay.
It wasn't a happy song, so that would make sense.
There you go, yeah.
But, that's the only reason. If you just listen to the beat by itself, you wouldn't have any idea who composed it, what their race or nationality or anything could be. And to me, that makes the whole thing super plastic. We don't like the plastic stuff. We want something to have, be rooted in something that's human, not artificial. And so much of the music now is totally artificial. And the crisis really began in the 60s in the classical world because they threw out all the hierarchies. Well, anything that's indigenous that came up, whether it was like the rap music of the late 70s, early 80s, all the way up to the mid 90s. You have this great new indigenous music that came out of basically poor Black America. And what happens, it's totally appropriating this plastic pop stuff now, and it's awful.
So this is so interesting again because, in order to make this work, you basically have to just stomp on every natural feeling that you have, right? Every natural attachment that you have in favor of this kind of idealized, ideological commitment to one world nation. Which, given everything that we've been saying about music, kind of kills music, right? I mean, if music is the thing that taps into your most basic connection with the universe, your most basic pleasures, your most basic delights and aesthetic excitement, then it's basically death to music to homogenize it.
Where are the classical music masterpieces of the last 50 years that anybody could just name?
Well, I assume you're writing them. I mean,
that's what I'm doing right now is because I had to, because I went to a conservatory and I mean, they pushed the postmodern stuff really, really hard. And I had to actively reject that, take the C+, so
Wow.
for real,
Wow,
take the C+, and then go off and do my own thing.
Yeah.
And so one of the only places that you can do music that is meant to be beautiful is in film.
Wow.
And so that's why I ended up in LA eventually and have to do it out here.
So has film become the place basically for American classical music to go?
Yes. John Williams is the perfect evidence of that.
Right.
E.T., Schindler's List,
Right.
Jaws,
Oh, yeah.
Indiana Jones, Star Wars. Like these are the only masterpieces of like the last 50 years or so that are going to last way past the time the guy dies.
And you can tell they're masterpieces because people sniff at them. I'm sure that every time you say that, somebody goes like, oh, John Williams. Is it?
Film composer.
Yeah. Well, this has been the fate of many a great composer.
Yes.
I mean, the name that comes immediately to my mind from ancient Greece is Timotheus of Miletus, who famously was kind of Plato was sniffed about his kind of music, a very new, innovative, experiment with stuff, but in a formal way, in a way that was sort of within the bounds of how Greek music worked. Nary a generation after his death, people were playing Timotheus' music as if it were the great old standards of Greece.
Yeah, sure.
Jesus says to the Pharisees, right, like you worship the prophets, but your fathers killed the prophets.
Yeah,
right? I mean, this is kind of
yeah.
how it works.
That's like Aristophanes at his competition for clouds or whatever. He got like third place.
Yeah. There's a lot.
But that's the only thing anybody remembers from then because it was the best one. But contemporary, it's difficult. Like here's where I give the audience and maybe even some critics, like I'll cut them a little slack because our job as artists is to introduce to you folks something brand new.
Okay.
So sometimes it's hard for a culture or people individually to wrap their minds around what they're listening to first.
Right.
Belle Époque composer Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, it caused a riot in the ballet because they thought it was so horrible.
Now we have to just play like a cut of
Rite of Spring,
the Rite of Spring now so that we can our hair can catch on fire. I want this conversation to go on forever. It does, I doubt that we can upload the file onto iTunes if it does in fact go on forever. And so I just want briefly for you to tell me what you're working on now.
Yes.
And what you're excited about.
Yeah. So next I've got a film coming out that I'm doing the score for. Okay. Amanda Milius is the director. Yeah. It's called Plot Against the President.
And nobody knows that you're working on this, right?
Nobody knows that I'm working on it. You all do now.
Yeah.
I can release no other information.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So far.
Plot Against the President.
Plot Against the President. It's based off of the Lee Smith book of the same title.
And this is, again, we've talked so much about the intersection between music and politics that, in some sense, your work is scoring some of the big political events of our recent past. Well, that's awesome. Usually what I do at the end of these episodes, I take a mailbag question from the group, from the audience. And I was actually wondering, again, the first guest I've done this with, but I was wondering if you could do a mailbag.
Yes.
Quite turn the tables on me. I've been grilling you this whole time.
I am the mailbag.
Yes, so, be the mailbag.
Here's what I've wanted to do. My wife got me Iliad and the Odyssey. Yeah. I'm like, great, I'm going to read some classic literature, the first one. And so, here it is. Yeah. I open this thing up, and I'm like, I don't know where to start with this because I read a paragraph and I don't get it. Like, I guess it's supposed to rhyme and have like some rhythm to it. Like I'm not that dumb, but like I'm having a hard trouble following along. How do I do this?
I'm actually really, this is cool. So can I take this book? Thank you. So a lot of people have been asking this question, actually. You are not the only mailbag questioner to ask this. Our first episode was on Homer's Iliad. I am currently holding up the Robert Fagel's translation of the Iliad, which is my sort of preferred favorite English version. And when we talked about the Iliad, people were like, wow, that was a really fun episode. I can't get into this poem. And so you are not alone. I have a few pieces of advice. I mean, my first piece of advice is to take the pressure off of yourself. And I say this to people all the time because this book is itself a doorstopper, but it is also just has this huge clout. And you feel like if you don't get it, you're the problem. Right?
I am dumb.
You are dumb.
Me
you are
am
the problem.
dumb.
You am dumb, right? And so I mean, one thing that you mentioned, so you said it's supposed to rhyme. It's actually not supposed to rhyme.
Oh, okay.
And that's kind of one of the major things. One reason why like a good introduction to one of these poems will sort of help you along is that Greek poetry does not rhyme. It's one of the things that distinguishes it. Ancient Greek poetry does not rhyme, distinguishes it from English poetry. The other thing that distinguishes it from English poetry, and we talked about this when we talked about the Iliad, but it bears revisiting, especially with you, is that this poetry is music. I mean, these are songs, memorized songs, if you couldn't believe it, from the ancient world, from the 8th century, perhaps BC, sort of somewhere around there, we're not totally sure. And a good translation, like I believe the Fables is a good translation, will try to capture the fact, I call it hoofbeats and heartbeats. It's this dactylic hexameter rhythm. This sort of like, so read it aloud. So read it aloud, right? I mean, like this is the thing. I would sort of take the book and just start at least until it gets into your head, right? I'll read the Fagles now because it's so good, right? Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that costs the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feasts for the dogs and birds. So this, you get this
That's
kind
beautiful.
of ripping, really lovely, and you don't, I would just say sort of, and actually we talked about this when we talked about T.S. Eliot, is like the first time around, don't beat yourself up if you don't understand everything that's going on.
Yeah, right.
Like because and people, I'm sure people give this to you with music all the time. It's like I don't get it. Well, actually, like make this book your life companion. Don't just like sit down with it and be like I did it or I didn't get it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
These are my points of advice for you and the other people who are asking that question.
Sweet.
Yeah. So for all of you out there, actually, who have been listening, thanks again. It's been such a pleasure and a joy. We will see you again next week. If you like this show, as I always say, you will probably love the work that I do for the Claremont Institute, my employers. They're very gracious to let me do this side project. So do check out ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com and AmericanMind.org, where I write, and also a lot of people who are way smarter than me write a lot of great stuff about the American ideals. And if you would like to, please go to claremont.org/donate and give us a little help. It's a great time to support the Claremont Institute. Thanks again for listening. Thank you, Stephen Limbaugh, for being here with us. We will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.